Hey everybody, let me move this mic a little closer to me, and welcome back to the Media Boat Podcast's March Madness 2024 tournament, where we are talking about the last 16 years of Oscar Best Picture winners, having them face off in a March Madness style tournament bracket to determine one that is better than the rest. One Best Picture to rule them all, if you will. No, Lord of the Rings is not eligible because that was over 16 years ago. But don't you wish it was here. But yeah, we already started this adventure last week with parts 1 and 2. This is part 3. So far, let's go over what we've done so far in the bracket. That is the wrong image. There we go. That's what we want to see. This is our current status for this tournament bracket. We had last week facing off Everything Everywhere All at Once versus Parasite, where Parasite ended up moving on to the second round. We had Birdman versus The Artist, where The Artist took the win. Then we had, in part 2, Coda against Nomadland, with Nomadland edging out Coda. And then Moonlight narrowly edging out Slumdog Millionaire. Today, in parts 1 and 2 here, or parts 3 and 4 here, we're going to discuss the latter half of round 1 here. Let me just verify that that's going to work out. Yeah, I think so. Where we have a couple of new genres here. I'm going to pull something up real quick. Bear with me as I switch back to chatting. I'm going to switch back over here to get another document up that I should have had up, where Mike, as I mentioned last week, is not participating in most of this. He will join me for the finale of this tournament, but he did help by introducing a way to separate these competitors here into 4 different genre categories. So in part 1, we had genre-breaking films, Everything Everywhere, Parasite, Birdman, and The Artist. Movies that kind of take a little free agency with the kind of genre that they're in. Group 2 was social commentary in human stories. That was Coda, Nomadland, Moonlight, and Slumdog Millionaire, for obvious reasons. This week in part 3, we're going to talk about Group 3, historical dramas and biopics. You know the type. Hollywood loves to award stories about Hollywood's history or American history, and these 4 are those, although some venture outside of the U.S. Well, one in particular. We'll get there in a second. So, our face-offs this week begin with Green Book, the winner from 2018, against 12 Years a Slave, the Best Picture winner from 2013. Oh boy, here we go. I am probably not the right person to talk about these movies, as you might imagine. Both are stories about racism, specifically one about more modern racism and one that goes back to the days of slavery in the United States. Both have heavy subject matter about what it means to be black and black history, and, well, I'm not necessarily the best person to talk to either of these films because of that. Kind of well like what I talked about last week with Moonlight and Slumdog Millionaire. It is always wonderful when Oscar awards and has these serious conversations about these stories about the black struggle, about black people. And these are 2 more of those films. And it's great that these won Best Picture. However, they're doing very different things. And also, it's important to note that one was, let's say, more of a shoo-in to win than the other. Yes, Green Book has gone down in history as being kind of an upset of a win for Best Picture. I don't think people anticipated going into the night that Green Book was a favorite. From what I understand, it's not super critically beloved, which is a perfect segue into talking about the numbers. Let's talk about the numbers here. Going to our spreadsheet of stats here. So if you missed last week's shows, basically what I've done here is I have the Metacritic, the critical average, and I have the box office worldwide numbers to consider for all of these films. So, on the subject of Green Book, it has a extremely low 69 Metacritic score. That's not nice. It is, in fact, the lowest Metacritic on this entire list of 16 films. So, mixed reaction to Green Book upon release. As for box office, however, it did pretty decently worldwide. It made $321.8 million. That is one of the higher numbers on this list out of the 16 films. Best Picture winners aren't always big blockbusters, but every once in a while you get to see higher numbers. Green Book happened to have a lot of eyes on it. Probably a lot due to its cast. Stellar cast in that movie. Just what you do with the cast matters. Meanwhile, its competitor here, 12 Years a Slave, 96 Metacritic, which is extremely high, and a worldwide box office of $187.7 million, which is much lower than that of Green Book. Again, these two movies are doing different things. The Green Book, in case you don't know, was a book that was used as kind of a travel destination guide to black people so that we know where to go and where to avoid. So Green Book, the film, is a discussion of that and depicts what it was like to live in those kinds of times for black people. 12 Years a Slave, as the name explains, is about being in slavery during that time in the U.S.'s dark history. One obviously is going to be a little bit heavier subject matter than the other. That is to be expected. You don't go into a film called 12 Years a Slave without preparing yourself for that kind of heaviness. And thus, I think it has an artistry and a responsibility to do a lot more than perhaps what Green Book was doing. And you see that reflected in the critical reception. Also, again, it was largely the favorite to win that category in its year, 12 Years a Slave. Whereas Green Book famously was not necessarily the movie that a lot of people thought should have won that category that year. So I think that just looking at the numbers here and just thinking about the two films in relation to each other and its context of their wins, this kind of has to be 12 Years a Slave. Green Book, like I said, has a reputation of being one of those maybe it shouldn't have won kind of Oscar wins. So 12 Years a Slave might have the advantage. So I'm going to move it on to round two. Let's talk about these next two bunched up here against each other. We have 2012's Best Picture Argo versus 2009's The King's Speech. So in both cases here, we have movies that are historical dramas that are both about, let's say, historical events that have a lighter side as well as a more complicated side to them. For Argo, obviously the complication is the hostages in Iran, and that kind of juxtaposed with this strategy to take the hostages back that involved a fake movie. U.S. producers basically creating a fake movie as kind of a way to get those hostages negotiated out of capture. Meanwhile, The King's Speech is a very true story about a king that had a speech impediment that prohibited from making an important speech about World War II and about the the UK's involvement in said war. But at the same time, even though that sounds heavy, it's kind of a lighter atmosphere when you're talking about teaching someone, to get over a stutter. And in that way, there's some lighter comic elements of that, balancing out the story. So both, I think, have that in common, at least tonally. They both kind of oscillate between moments of comedy and moments of drama. But where do they differ? Let's go to the numbers. So, looking at Argo, an 86 Metacritic, which is not too bad, not too high. It's right in the middle there, where you expect a well-reviewed, generally consensus good movie ends up on Metacritic. And then box office-wise, an okay 232 million worldwide. Not the highest numbers we've seen here, but also not nearly as low as something like Coda or Nomadland. So it's doing pretty well. As for its competitor here, The King's Speech, 88 on Metacritic, so a couple more points there. and a whopping $427.4 million worldwide. This is, as you see by my highlight there, the highest on this list of 16 films. A lot of people saw The King's Speech. It was a audience favorite, if not always a critical favorite, as the 88 implies, even though it was pretty well liked. Putting these two against each other is interesting because these are actually two that I've seen and saw at the time of their release. I remember really enjoying Argo. I thought it was real funny. I thought it was real well done. I thought it was real, not necessarily stressful, but I feel like there was real tension towards the end there to see whether or not this was going to be a success or not. I think it was a great example of how movies can be a combination of dramatic and comic elements and still work on a best picture scale. Meanwhile, The King's Speech, I think it's okay. I remember thinking it was all right when I saw it, but it was nominated in the same year as The Social Network, which I think that by far it should have won. So, what are you going to do? It's not as good as its competition is, I think, where The King's Speech kind of falters in my mind. But you can't argue with those numbers. The King's Speech, a lot of people saw that movie. It has a more general, accessible theme. Because the other thing to talk about with Argo is how it's depicting the hostage crisis. It's not necessarily maybe the most kind to the people it's depicting. It could have been a little bit more sensitive, I suppose. Can't really use that with The King's Speech. It's a little older. It's a little more specifically British, which is again a strength towards it that Argo can't necessarily carry through. It's tough. This might be the toughest face-off we've had in this bracket so far. It's not an easy yes or no which one of these does the more impressive job. So ultimately, I think it's going to get down to personal taste here. I really remember liking Argo. I haven't seen it in a while. And The King's Speech I have less affinity for it. So just by a nose, I'm going to move Argo to the next round here. Again, feel free to yell at me in the comments. Feel free to email us if you disagree. But hey, this is the Media Boat Podcast show. And I'm going to make what Media Boat Podcast thinks. I mean, Mike could be way off of where I land on a lot of these. But I'm going to move Argo to the second round. So, that will do it for this episode. This part 3 of this tournament. And we will be back with part 4 right after this. Go to YouTube to see these. You can also find them on MediaBoatPodcast.com, where I am posting the YouTube videos in a website forum. So check that out. Meanwhile, I've been Matt. This has been the Media Boat Podcast, and I'll see you next time.